the top of my head, I find it hard to think of anything more likely to create a sense of crushing pressure and desperation on the part of everyone in this story. A mother looking down at their child in one of these temples, thinking about what the next 24 hours might look like. The soldier on the front line thinking about his family back in these temples and knowing what happens in the sacking of cities in the ancient world normally, thinking about that happening to the people. I can't think of anything more likely to make me fight with unbelievable ferocity than that. And it still blows my mind that when the Thebans apparently had a get-out-of-jail-free card here, and none of this had to happen, they didn't use it. Right? They were offered the chance to get out of this with just handing over a couple of ringleaders, a couple of these revolutionary thugs who came into the city, maybe Arian would say, and hoodwinked the people, and they turned it down. All they had to do was give up their freedom, and none of this has to happen. And if this turns out the way it's likely to turn out, they're not going to have any freedom anyway. That's the real irony of the whole deal. And this is what they chose. And they thought they were going to have help. But interestingly enough, the other Greek states who also, want their own freedom, autonomy, liberty, and all that sort of stuff, whatever it means to them, they think that maybe the Thebans are getting what they deserve here because, after all, nobody told you to be that thick-necked about it, right? You could have negotiated. That's what the oracles and the signs were all saying, and the prophecies, but you had to go be all thick-necked about it. You had to take that give me liberty or give me death thing a little bit too literally. Well, can't help it this time. And the Thebans, knowing this, go through with this anyway. It's a very interesting situation. Diodorus looks at it as positively heroic. Arian says Alexander marches his army around to the side of one of Thebes' walls at a certain point. The city's, you have to imagine the city's surrounded by a nice stout wall all the way around. But on one part of it, it butts right up to that area where Alexander's Macedonian garrison is trapped and has been under siege since this little revolution began, right? The Thebans built a couple of palisades out there to sort of wall it off from any sort of help. But it's right up against the wall.
This is how to get cheap fast. If you want to drop this, or any more of these, you might think this would take years to learn, but I'm going to teach it to you in 60 seconds. Watch this.
Visceral fat can cause inflammation, accumulate in the heart, muscles, and the liver. Visceral fat is like a direct line to metabolic and cardiovascular disease. This type of abdominal fat is associated with a higher risk of
those palisades. I had to look it up to get a real good idea. What they mean when they say that is that, and there's can be variations, or imagine those sorts of walls that you've seen that are essentially a bunch of tree trunks sharpened at the top and then placed in the ground, one right next to another, so there's no gaps between them. And there's a couple of those, a couple of lines of space for troops to fight in between that now is sort of, if you think about it this way, the weak spot in the defenses. Because instead of the stout regular wall of Thebes, they have this, double sort of temporary wall, and that's where Alexander takes his troops over to that side. Because if he can punch through there, he's also right by, where all his other soldiers are trapped, and the garrison can link up with his forces, and then it's all over. The Thebans know this too, so that's where they've placed their troops, and this whole battle is going to be fought over these barricades. It's a barricade battle, if you will. It's good for the Thebans. It nullifies some of what the Macedonians do best, sort of is a great equalizer, didn't just have force multiplier earlier, but they're still outnumbered 4 or 5 to 1. And while they're regular soldiers, they're 7,000 infantry and cavalry, are very good. You can't count on the slaves to do well against the Macedonians, or your traveling salesman, or your guy just vacationing in Thebes, or to visit his mother, or whatever it is that you just armed. This is a bit of a last stand sort of deal. It reminds me of all the great last stands in history, from Thermopylae to the Alamo and all those kinds of things. With a small chance of success, Diodorus makes it a little bit more of a close-run thing. Diodorus and Plutarch both have Alexander sort of preparing his forces for the assault, and then when he's ready, when the artillery is assembled, launching it essentially pretty straightforward. Arian, on the other hand, as we've already alluded to Ptolemy as a source, and Ptolemy having every reason to absolve Alexander for as much of this responsibility as possible, says that the fighting started when one of Alexander's subordinates, named Perdiccas, attacked with his forces without orders, an unauthorized assault. The leader of the unauthorized assault just happens to be the archenemy of Ptolemy. So, I mean, think about how elegant this is. He gets to write his history, he gets to laud and sort of defend his boss and friend and the person he owes his legitimacy to, while at the same time turning around and shifting the blame for all these terrible things Alexander's critics say about, how he handled all this Theban stuff, and blame it all on his worst enemy. It's a two-for-one deal. It's wonderful. But we have to notice it. Doesn't mean it didn't happen. Adrian Goldsworthy, in his Philip and Alexander, he talks about how when you station troops so close together, maybe with that barricade in between them, but think about the things that are said to one another. It's not uncommon for troops to sort of, in an unauthorized way, just lose it in assault. When that happens, though, no matter what the reason, Alexander is forced to throw in more troops to protect the flank so that Perdiccas and his forces don't get cut off and surrounded. That sucks in eventually the rest of Alexander's army, and the Arian account is one where Alexander never even really launched the assault on Thebes. He just got dragged into it. Plausible deniability, or whatever happens next. It's all Perdiccas' fault. Perdiccas, though, in the Diodorus version, is like the hero, the guy who leads sort of a commando assault when Alexander, somewhere in the midst of the fighting, sees an unguarded gate or door. But before that happens, things break out over the palisade. Diodorus says everybody starts throwing everything they can over sort of the divide. It's easier for me to envision this kind of a battle than a more open, ancient battle, because you can see this sometimes in riots. And go look at riot footage where you have a barricade, essentially, of shields or a wall in there, and it breaks up the fighting and turns it into something that is pretty predictable. So these large groups of people, so throwing things over the barricade and pushing and shoving. No specific word on whether the artillery was used to punch a hole in one of these palisades, but somehow a hole is punched. And no one says, of course, how wide it is, but Perdiccas and his forces stream through and are able to get to the second palisade. Remember, there's one in open space and then another, but he and his troops get trapped there and stopped, and the fighting's going on. Alexander sends the Iranians and the archers, his famous quick strike force, into the breach, tells them to fan out. They start apparently trapping a Theban unit. Again, hard to imagine the sizes of the forces we're talking about here, but I love the way in Arian, he specifically says, over by the sunken road near the Temple of Heracles, as though it's still there, you can go see it. That's right where they got all trapped, and the archers are sort of keeping them at bay. And then at a certain point, Arian says, the Thebans who are kept at bay run away, the light troops chase them, and then at almost like a prearranged signal, the Thebans who are running away, with a shout, turn around in formation. You can almost see it's like a movie where the archers and everybody who are chasing them and so confident all of a sudden are at the point of the spears, and Arian says about 70 archers were killed along with their leader.
File your taxes 100% free in the app if you didn't use us last year. Just file with TurboTax Do-It-Yourself by February 18th. All tax forms and tax situations. Make the switch to TurboTax Do-It-Yourself and file free by February 18th.
I'm going to show you guys how my style went from this to this. All I had to do was fill out a style quiz. It asked me different things like my fit preference, any troubles I have while shopping. I get to try on everything at home and return anything that I don't like for free. You guys have to check it out.
The rest of them run back towards Alexander, supposedly, for the protection of the heavier troops. And while the Thebans who just killed those archers just turned around and yelled and had this temporary victory, while they're chasing now the people that used to be chasing them, they get all strung out, they lose formation, and then they run into Alexander and the close order troops. Diodorus has an account that is much more last standish, with the Thebans doing so well they almost win. He says they take on Alexander's first forces and they wear them down. He says that the Macedonians have the numbers and the depth of the formation, but the Thebans, because they go to the gym, are in better shape. The two sort of balance each other out for a while, and then after the Thebans, Diodorus says, send the first unit back to go rest and refit. Alexander throws in the reserves, which normally would do the trick, according to Diodorus. When the reserves come in, that's normally when it's over, but not this time. The Thebans fighting for all that they had, for freedom for their families, back in the temples, everything. They're holding their own now against the reserves, and sort of Diodorus has them like yelling slurs at each other, and who's superior now, all these kinds of things, but in a very Persians getting around the path of Thermopylae and attacking the Spartans in the rear way. As we said, Alexander specifically, maybe, according to these accounts, spies an unguarded gate or door or something in the walls. He sends Perdiccas, the hero of the Diodorus story, I guess you could say, the villain of the Aryan story, to go with some troops and take it. That gets him sort of behind the Theban defenses. And both Diodorus and Arian sort of have this moment. It's the same moment where everything sort of falls apart. And it's when the Thebans, in Arian's account, they sort of get, they panic. But in Diodorus's account, they realize that they've been compromised, and that the only way to not be surrounded is to back up into the walls of the city. So his is a more organized effort to continue the fight and just sort of retire to a better defensive position, whereas Arian makes it sound more like at a certain point everybody just sort of panics. Diodorus explains what happens though, and Arian, through his own lens, talks about the same incident. So this is clearly the key moment in the battle. Diodorus, from the low classical translation, and I think originally that was translated by C. Bradford Wells, Diodorus says, quote, "So the Theban spirit proved unshakable here, but the king, meaning Alexander, took note of a postern gate that had been deserted by its guards, and hurried Perdiccas with a large detachment of troops to seize it and penetrate into the city. He quickly carried out the order, and the Macedonians slipped through the gate into the city, while the Thebans, having worn down the first assault wave of Macedonians, stoutly faced the second, and still had high hopes of victory. When they knew that a section of the city had been taken, however, they began immediately to withdraw within its walls. But in this operation, their cavalry galloped along with the infantry into the city, and trampled upon and killed many of their own men. They themselves rode into the city in disorder, and encountering a maze of narrow alleys and trenches, lost their footing, and fell, and were killed by their own weapons. At the same time, the Macedonian garrison in the Cadmea burst out of the citadel, engaged the Thebans, and attacking them in their confusion made great slaughter among them." End quote.
Trocare is my family. Students aren't just a number, they're part of more of a community here.
As Diodorus says there, very quickly the Macedonians, when they broke through the city walls and got into the city, they ran up to where the Macedonian garrison was under siege, unsieged them, for lack of a better word, and had them join the fight too. So it's all over, except for the killing. The last stand, if you will, is made over by a particular temple, which makes you wonder if it was sort of the fallback point, maybe the agreed upon place where everybody meets if all, the worst happens, and maybe there's a lot of invalids and vulnerable population members holed up there, who knows? Bring the army back there and defend everybody as best you can. Eventually the defenders are surrounded on all sides. They will break. Arian has the cavalry running out of the city at high speed and over the plain and getting away, and the infantry trying to save their skins, as he says, as best they can. But at a certain point, it's hard to know when that moment specifically happens, but the vibe changes from one of fighting and battle where both sides are equally at risk to sacking and killing and pillaging and looting. Diodorus talks about all of the Theban fighters who were still scattered in little pockets all over the city. Remember, this is a big city, and they have these narrow little Greek streets with sometimes buildings 2, 3, 4 stories tall on either side. So these are little bottleneck killing zones where Diodorus has soldiers who are so, wounded from the fighting that they're essentially bleeding out slowly, supporting themselves on the haft of their broken spears, just waiting for some Macedonian to come down this little alley thinking he's looting and enjoying himself and that all the danger is over, and then boom, you can still take one with you, is what Churchill said, right? And that's how these Thebans and Diodorus' encounters looking at things, but otherwise it's pure murder, rape, and slaughter. This is the way in his book, Philip and Alexander, historian Adrian Goldsworthy puts it, quote, "The Macedonians sacked the city. They had done this before when cities had failed to surrender to Philip and forced him to take them by assault. But never before had they taken a Greek city as large and as famous as Thebes. Storming fortifications," Goldsworthy writes, "was dangerous, and they had lost 500 dead, as well as no doubt many others wounded, including Perdiccas. The survivors, their blood up, anger at the enemy still fresh, and in the narrow streets and dark houses of the city, able to do what they wished, judged only by the opinions of their comrades, killed, raped, and plundered at will." End quote. He then continues later, quote, "Murder and rape were accepted as inevitable when the city was stormed. While it is doubtful that Alexander and his officers could have controlled the army fully and entirely prevented such things, it is equally unlikely that they even thought to try, beyond protecting some households and individuals who were considered important or otherwise favored. This," Goldsworthy writes, "was just part of war, and from a pragmatic point of view, Philip and Alexander both recognized the power of terror." End quote. It wasn't just in terms of the atrocities, which again, if we're using modern terms here, made headlines everywhere. The Macedonians, especially in Arrian's account, get off a little easy here because the worst of the atrocities are blamed not on the Macedonians, but on the Greeks who are fighting with Alexander, right? The ones he called up and said, "Hey, we're going to be taking on your bully, you want to come?" Those guys have an axe to grind, long-standing problems and wounds and things that they could be angry at the Thebans about. They're finally getting a chance to take revenge, and they are taking revenge. As one historian said, though, while some of the worst atrocities might have been done by these Greek allies of Alexander's, the majority of what was done by the Macedonian soldiers. It didn't matter. It leaves an unbelievably bloody, horrific taste in the mouth of a guy like Diodorus, who you can just hear. We would say today he was a patriotic Greek, thinking of these ancestors of his from a couple hundred years previously, and it just hurts him to admit that the other Greeks were doing a lot of the terrible things, right? Fellow Greeks shouldn't be fighting fellow Greeks. Arrian is almost happy to blame it on them because it means it's not Alexander's fault. Diodorus from the Low Classical Translation says, quote, "All the city was pillaged. Everywhere, boys and girls were dragged into captivity as they wailed piteously the names of their mothers. In sum," meaning in total, "households were seized with all their members, and the city's enslavement was complete. Of the men who remained," he writes, "some, wounded and dying, grappled with the foe, and were slain themselves as they destroyed their enemy. Others, supported only by a shattered spear, went to meet their assailants, and in the supreme struggle, held freedom dearer than life. As the slaughter mounted," Diodorus said, "and every corner of the city was piled high with corpses, no one could have failed to pity the plight of the unfortunates." End quote. Now the part that hurts this guy. We would call him a patriotic Greek today, and Greeks should not be doing this to other Greeks, but it must have gone on so much that even he has to admit it. And he says that these people who hated the Thracians got into the city with Alexander and did some horrible things. He writes, quote, "For even Greeks, Thespians, Plataeans, and Orchomenians and some others hostile to Thebes, who had joined the king in the campaign, King Alexander, invaded the city along with him, and now demonstrated their own hatred amid the calamities of the unfortunate victims. So it was that many terrible things befell the city, he writes. Greeks were mercilessly slain by Greeks. Relatives were butchered by their own relatives, and even a common dialect induced no pity. In the end, he writes, when night finally intervened, the houses had been plundered, and the children and women and aged persons who had fled into the temples were torn from sanctuary and subjected to outrage without limit. Over 6,000 Thebans perished, more than 30,000 were captured, and the amount of property plundered was unbelievable. End quote. But what to do with all this stuff? Alexander famously holds a sort of a ad hoc, spur of the moment, made up of what we have around us kind of legal counsel to sort of represent the League of Corinth in miniature. They're going to have a sort of a hearing. What do we do here with our slaves in this city and what's left? What we didn't kill, what's going to happen to all of this? Now, this is another one of these things where half the time Alexander sounds like a barbarian stomping around doing whatever he wants to do, no rules apply and whatever, and the other half of the time he sounds like everything is strictly legal. All the arguments he makes with other Greek city-states can be made by lawyers. In this case, he's turning it over to someone else, and he says to these other Greeks, well, listen, I'm just the representative, I'm the hegemon of this organization, but we're going to vote on what happens to the Thebans. Unfortunately, it seems that the majority of the people who could be scraped up on the spur of the moment, either accidentally or on purpose, are all these little city-states around Thebes that have been victims of its bullying forever. And somehow the deal is, if they vote the worst possible penalty, the land that Thebes had will be parceled out amongst them. So what should we do to the Thebans? And if this was a gladiatorial contest, they give it the thumbs down. Now, Alexander, as so many historians have pointed out, will just basically do what they tell him to do, but as everyone says, but if he didn't want to do this, it wouldn't have happened. So this is cover. The thing is nobody can really believe anything like this will happen. I mean, if you want to use a modern term for what Thebes is in terms of how important a Greek city-state it is a city-state too big to fail. You just can't believe anybody would destroy it. I mean, Greek city-states have been destroyed before, but not like this. I mean, you know, if Athens is New York and Sparta was Chicago, then Thebes is Los Angeles, right? Once upon a time, Chicago was bigger than Los Angeles, but this time Los Angeles has eclipsed it, and I mean, you wouldn't want to destroy Los Angeles, which, I mean, you know, some of you might, but the whole point being that you can't imagine the waste involved in taking out something that large and important and meaningful. Well, interesting enough, I was reading, it might have been Voldemar Heckle, but it was somebody making a point I hadn't thought about really, which was that the logical play here for the arguments being made, because it's almost like a hearing, right? That the other Theban bully victims would have every right to talk about all the things Thebes had done to them, right? We're going to pay them back because look at all these things. It's only fair, justice. But that's not what they do. They bring up the fact that the Thebans sided with the Persians 150 years ago. That's the angle they push, which happens to be perfectly lined up with Alexander's propaganda angle here for this war. We're paying back these Persians for what they did to us 150 years ago, and oh yeah, the Thebans were on their side. And did you hear what they said to me? Alexander would have probably had somebody say for him. When we were all standing there, we all heard it. Come and join the great king. Thebans and the great king working together again. Wiping out Thebes is like saying, these guys were betraying us. The rest of Greece to the cause. They went against the League of Corinth. They violated the rules. They're like an enemy in our midst. They're working with the great king. They're taking money. All these weapons. They killed 500 of my troops in this encounter representing you, the League of Corinth. Were paid for by the great king's money. Oh yeah, it wasn't my decision anyway, and all these other people from around the region decide it's thumbs down for Thebes. And the city will end up being so totally destroyed that I read one historian once that said it might as well have been done by an atomic weapon.
5-minute warning for title.
Sounds good.
In typical Greek fashion, he exempts the temples from destruction. That's normal. In typically Alexandrian fashion, he exempts the descendants of a particular poet that praised the Macedonians in the past. But otherwise, it's 30,000 people sold into slavery and a rule put into place that says that after we destroy the city where these people live and scatter them to the winds, anyone who takes them in is guilty of a crime. A.B. Bosworth sums the whole affair up when he says, in Conquest and Empire, quote, "The Greek world now had a shocking example of the consequences of resistance. One of the leading cities of the Greek world had been destroyed in a single day, as though by visitation of the gods." So Aeschines lamented in 330. And the litany of shock and sorrow was to be repeated through the centuries. There was a groundswell of sympathy for the victims. Despite the prohibition, Bosworth writes, against giving succor to the refugees, they were received into neighboring cities, notably Athens and Acrophenia. And nearly 20 years later, when Cassander proclaimed the restoration of Thebes, there was enthusiastic support from as far afield as Italy and Sicily. Though, Bosworth writes, the immediate reaction was panic. End quote. The Greeks start bowing and scraping in a toady-like fashion. Not the Spartans, but they've never been a part of this League of Corinth, but like the Arcadians, who got an army together, sent it to the Isthmus and waited. They vote to execute the people who proposed sending that army up there, the ones who led it. Yeah, those guys, they were way out of line. Athens sends representatives along with everyone else, but at the same time, they're preparing for a siege. They figure they're next. Meanwhile, they're sending representatives. This is so convenient. Like, they're the same ones, remember, who said that nobody could find any sanctuary if they assassinated Philip II. They said that right at his games, and then he was killed 5 minutes later, and they were celebrating it. Well, they're doing it again. As soon as Alexander, is available, they send their representative saying, "Oh my goodness, thank goodness you made it safe back from Illyria and from fighting those Triballis. And God, we thought you were dead, and we're so glad you're not. And we thoroughly approve of that punishment that you handed out to Thebes." And Peter Green said Alexander was probably amused by this, but he didn't take it seriously. He demanded they hand over the most vociferous anti-Macedonian demagogues among them, including our friend Demosthenes. What do you think's going to happen to these guys? It puts Athens in the most agonizing position you can imagine. It's a little like imagining the Germans in the Second World War after France is defeated and the British decide to give in and they're beaten and they're going to be, completely destroyed and blood will run in the streets of London and everything, unless the deal is that Hitler wants Churchill. Give me Churchill and those friends of Churchill who've all been saying bad things about me and we'll call it okay. Demosthenes is horrified and says it's a little like turning over the sheepdog who's been protecting the flock to the wolves, who's been warning you of the dangers of Darth Vader all this time, and now it's Darth Vader's son, and I've been right the whole time, and sure, I've had to trick us into doing the right thing sometimes, and sure, I brought out that guy in bandages who was limping around saying he saw Alexander dead, but it was all to do the right thing to preserve our liberty, and I realize it's come to this right now, and he's in a real boat, and he's got adversaries up there who must have been smiling to themselves at the opportunity to watch him squirm. Some of the orators get up and say that if Demosthenes, was any kind of real patriot, he'd willingly and proudly go to his death, right? He'd be proud to walk up there and die as a sacrifice to his city. And it really puts you on sort of the horns of a dilemma situation, right? You don't want to look like a coward. You don't want to look like someone who wouldn't die for his city. At the same time, my goodness, I didn't do all this fighting to have the stupid sheep turn me over to the wolf. It's an interesting sort of thing to wonder about, and the way he gets out of this is in the most Athenian-like way. Someone talks Alexander out of it. The Athenians are the great diplomats, the great talkers, and a particular Athenian diplomat, some stories have him getting a lot of money from Demosthenes to do this, is able to go to Alexander and have his demands cut down to just one guy, who's only going to be banished and who immediately runs to the king of Persia for sanctuary. Somehow, Demosthenes is slippery enough to get out again, almost literally by the skin of his teeth. But Alexander, as we had said, he felt outside the walls of Thebes, has bigger fish to fry. He figures he's made his point with the destruction of Thebes. The sources say that he feels so bad now about what happened to Thebes that if he ever got a request from a Theban in the future, he would grant it. But we should also point out that it will not be during his lifetime that ban on taking in any Theban refugees will be lifted. But it's a sign of how the Greeks feel about Alexander forever afterwards, that they violated that law regularly. And as Peter Green said, what Alexander did to Thebes was one of the worst decisions he ever made, and the Greeks hated him forever for it.
If you think the show you just heard is worth $1, Dan and Ben would love to have it. $1 a show, it's all we ask. Go to dancarlin.com for information on how to donate to the show.
For Hardcore History t-shirts or other merchandise, go to dancarlin.com.
Want to get your hands on all the older hardcore history shows? Just go to dancarlin.com and click on the merchandise tab and catch up on what you've missed.
The fact that I'm doing this just reminds me it's past due time to get some more liners cut. But some social media addresses to share with you. The gold standard is the dancarlin.substack.com account, because with that we'll send you an email with something we're going to tell you. So if that sounds like a good idea, sign up for that. We now have a Blue Sky account for those of you who use that. My attempts to try to stay with a balkanized audience wherever you all go so I can reach you is why there's so many more of these accounts. dancarlin.social for that one. At Dan Carlin Hardcore History on Instagram, of course at Hardcore History on X. I'm everywhere, man. I'm worldwide, global. What was the old line? Wasn't it a Dallas Cowboy who said I'm wall to wall and treetop tall? Well, if I am, I'm standing on the shoulders of giants, and that's you folks, and I appreciate all you do for me and my family. Thank you, and I hope you have a wonderful upcoming year. Stay safe. There's an old saying, but I told you that story to tell you this one. Because now, the first show we did was about Alexander, the context of his life, his upbringing in the army, that he was going to use, the tactics, all the things that set the stage for Alexander. Then the story we just finished is about Alexander taking over and his early challenges. Let's be honest, those early challenges could have finished him very easily. A lot of great conquerors in history, as I believe we said earlier, kind of never make it past their knife fights amongst the rocks in Illyria's stage. They're a little like the sea turtles that get born on the beach and have to run the gauntlet of predators to make it to the safety of the ocean, just to have an opportunity in life. A lot of the potential great conquerors lose their lives along the way. Alexander, 21, 22 years old now at this time in the story, is just at this moment, with Greece subdued behind him, with the barbarians cowed and all this, and the army ready to go, and he's drawing men from all these places that he's sort of subdued again. He's at the point now where he's facing his destiny, and he's one of these guys, at least the traditional stories always say, who can feel the hand of destiny when it's on him. Winston Churchill's another one of those guys. He wrote that when he was given the prime ministership, which of course the war had been going on a bit now, and Britain's already in a low point, and when he becomes prime minister, he wrote that he had one of those moments where he could just feel the hand of destiny. He wrote, quote, "I felt as if I were walking with destiny, and that all my past life had been but a preparation for this hour and this trial." End quote. wonders now, with all the roadblocks out of the way and everything he had to handle to get his house in order, one wonders if Alexander's feeling the hand of destiny on his shoulders as he proceeds to cross his own version of the Rubicon, if you will, and test himself against the greatest land empire that had ever been. The richest, the biggest geographical territory, and almost mythically old in terms of the way the Greeks would have seen it, right? But dating back to a tradition that goes to Assyria and Babylonia, and, once upon a time all the way to Sumeria. I mean, this is the great Middle Eastern inheritor of all that history from that region. And here are these upstart people that had to fight to even be considered Greek, led by a guy who, even though half of him is that people that's had to fight to be considered Greek, the other half of him straight up Everett. And from which country? Sorceryville. That's the guy that's going to lead this and try to carry out his father's plan, which has not come down to us, and maybe Alexander didn't even know it. I gotta believe he did, but maybe he didn't. Because no one knows what Philip was going to do. Right? You just fight the Persians and see how it goes, take your chances, grab what you can, or do you have a plan to attack and take a certain amount of territory? I mean, what is the limits of this idea, right? Where are the natural boundaries that you're trying to establish here? That's where Alexander's psychology, once again, is going to come into play. The man who can feel the hand of destiny on his shoulders, who was infused both by the environment in which he grew up in, but also by the teachings of Aristotle on the subject of arete, to try to be the best at whatever you try to do. And then he's got this Icarus and the sun potential relationship with the idea of ambition. And he may already be entertaining the idea that he might be the son of a god. It's all a very interesting mixture of stuff that's going to lead us into some in all history. All that and more in part 3, The Mania for Subjugation. I have some sad news to pass along if you hadn't heard it already through one of our other informational channels. In September, we unexpectedly and tragically lost our artist of 18-some years, the fabulous Nick Lay. He was only in his early 40s, and so it was a complete shock to us. And obviously hit us on so many levels, right? Personal, business, everything you could think of. When we lost the fabulous Bill Barrett, we did an audio program on the Hardcore History Addendum feed where we showcased his work, right? He was an audio guy, so the work was audio. Nick is a visual guy, or was a visual guy, and so we did a Substack post highlighting some of his work and how, some of the more noted covers came to be and whatnot. You can go over to substack.dancarlin.com for free, of course, and check out that story if you like and see things Nick added to our work. We said if I was the Hunter S. Thompson character in this relationship, it was Ralph Steadman, and his art became associated with what we did. We love him, we miss him, we're still in shock. And we had to pivot quickly, and thank goodness we ran into Eric Sayers, who was taken on the unenviable task of following the legend and something whose work is very closely associated with us. I told Eric I compare it to having your favorite comic book losing its artist, and having to now have another artist come and pick up the book from where the last artist left off, and it's hard to get used to initially, but over time you look back and you just refer to the first era as associated with that, as the Nick Lay era, and now a new era begins, and we think of Nick fondly, we miss him, and we send our love to his family.
Working in the OR is the best thing ever.
I'm working next to doctors and nurses.
Our Surge Tech graduates have 100% passing rate on their certification exam and 100% job placement.
Would you like to receive an email from us whenever a new show is released? Well, now you can. Listeners, and what would bonus content be? By the way, you don't age. No relationship, Dan Carlin. Any tribes, length and breadth of the distances involved, because in snow it's hardcore, thanks to the listener who suggested that. Any anyone who has listened to me for any period of time already knows how deeply interested I am in the many and various peoples and tribes who occupy the area that's known as the Eurasian steppe. The Eurasian steppe is a geographical feature, and it's not the same. It changes over the length and breadth of the distances involved, because the distances are vast, stretching all the way from the edges of Central Europe to the borders of China, places like Manchuria, the northern area of India, northern area of Iran. I mean, it's one of these areas that's been a very important part of human history, and that touches a ton of societies that were in Eurasian history some of the key important places. So they've been involved in human history and important events from the get-go, basically. And if you look at some of the names of the peoples involved, the tribes and the tribal confederacies, it's obvious. I mean, to use or interesting person, be fascinated with the unique weapon system of the peoples of the steppe in recorded histories era anyway. I mean, this mixture of a people that grow up riding horses from the time they're toddling around and using powerful composite bows at the same time. You create a weapon system that won't be solvable for the people of the enemies of the steppe people until gunpowder becomes commonplace. If you're interested in those sorts of people and their history, as I am, there are several new books that have come out that are just wonderful additions to your library, and I can't help but marvel at the differences between the modern day works and the stuff that I grew up with, because there's so much new information. I think, in the last 40 years, new information out there that fills in all these dark areas that my earlier histories had, and they're big events. The disintegration of the Soviet Union, the opening of China in the early 70s, the DNA testing that's been happening, all these sorts of things has broadened the informational storehouses that people who work in any number of different disciplines, bioarchaeology is my current favorite in terms of always mentioning, but archaeologists, anthropologists, linguistic people, and of course, historians, putting together works that compile all sorts of information from all sorts of sources that give us a much more nuanced and comprehensive view of all these peoples. One of the books that's recently come out is by a Tulane professor who's an expert on this subject named Kenneth W. Harrell. It's called Empires of the Steppes, the history of the nomadic tribes who shaped civilization. He is a noted expert on the subject. The book is one of those that when you read it, even if you're interested and have read a lot about this subject, you're going to marvel at his ability to dredge up even things like personal names of some of these early leaders of some of these steppe confederacies, things that were only considered practically legendary when I was a kid, or perhaps even fragmentary type stuff. They have much more information, and of course the DNA evidence and things like isotope evidence that's coming out now fleshes things out even further. We discussed this with Professor Harrell recently, and the interview about Empires of the Steppes, well, happens right now. I have been reading books about the people of the steppe since the 1970s. I am absolutely overwhelmed by the comprehensiveness of your work. I mean, the number of books that I have where everything seems to be in darkness in most of the, like you'll have little data points from here and there, and yet you've got all this information that sort of fills in the blanks from all those years. Talk to me about some of the changes in the study and writing about the history of the people of the steppe over the last 3, 4, 5 decades, in terms of what sources you've been able to consult and how you've been weaving this stuff into a more three-dimensional, comprehensive kind of tale.
Well, there's two things going on. One is world scholarship, and then is my own experience in teaching a wide range of courses. First, in terms of the world of scholarship, there's been important finds made in archaeology above all. You have a lot of books concentrating on the Silk Road and the products that were exchanged, Often these are restricted in time, from a certain date to another date. You also have a lot of important monographic studies, especially on the Mongol Khans, which have been well studied by specialists who read the Mongol language and also understand the Chinese text. And all of these advances have been significant. And the problem is, it's such a vast area and it covers such a long time that no one can claim to be an expert in any one particular field. I'm very much at home on the western end of it, or if I'm dealing with Turks, because I know Turkish. On the other hand, there are people who stay on the eastern steppes of China and the Mongols, and what I attempted to do was what I do in my classes, which is to create a sweeping narrative to understand how events unfolded. And that required me to bring to bear all sorts of training that I had gained, especially as a classical historian, trained in Greek and Latin and comparative Indo-European linguistics, and my understanding of history, and drawing upon the incredible work that's been done in the last, I would say, 4 decades. Really, our knowledge of these people advanced immensely. You think of the Tarim Basin mummies that were discovered and have been analyzed, that proved apparently Indo-Europeans had occupied this area at a very early time, the Tarim Basin, which is now in western China. And putting this information together was a real challenge. I fortunately had the time. I was consigned to my house because of the pandemic, and I really wrote this book on a sabbatical leave where COVID-19 was raging across the United States, and I kept myself occupied putting all of my notes and thoughts together, which I've been looking at for a long time. And so that's what's come together. All of this very, very significant research done by different scholars. I think of the work done on the Kushans. There was a very important inscription discovered in Afghanistan that revealed the descent of the Kushan kings and clarified the genealogy. There's been studies on ancient coins that have also clarified who issued these coins and how are they connected with steppe peoples. So it's a variety of sources, and they keep changing and adding, and I'm sure in the future there will be new discoveries. Some may vitiate some of my points, but I think the overall understanding is sound, and that the work at least conveys the sweep of the great events that occurred on the steppes since earliest times, when first people domesticated and herded animals, domesticated the horse, and developed this mobile way of life.
Okay, so this is your book covers basically from prehistory to almost the Renaissance, and we have an audience that will span the entire spectrum of people who know nothing about this subject to people who are pretty well versed about at least some of it. So maybe we start at the beginning, at a sort of a touchstone point that we can all relate to: geography and environment. Right? We have a part of the world in Eurasia that touches China on one side, the north of India, the north of Persia, the east of what we would consider to be the Central European areas. Talk to me a little bit about this area, because I always think about the geography and the environment as creating the conditions for the rise of this type of lifestyle. And I'm sure it's an idiotic thing to say, but I mean, I can see almost similarities to the American Great Plains sometimes, and you see the same sort of the way that they live in certain respects being similar. Talk to me a little bit about, I mean, if you're writing a book called The Empire of the Steppes, and you're talking to people who don't know anything about this, explain to us what the steppes are.
Well, actually, you made a good analogy about the Great Plains Indians, how when horses escaped from the Spanish sometime in the 1680s, I believe, and you had these Mustangs get out on the grasslands, the Great Prairies. These horses could live on the grasslands, and then Indians learned to domesticate them first as a food source and then to ride them. And it completely changed the culture and political landscape of the Great Prairie, which initially many European Americans simply thought was the Great American Desert. And this happened at an early date on the western end of that Eurasian steppe you just noted, which really ends in Hungary on the what's called the Pannonian Plain, stretches across southern Russia and Ukraine, and stretches all the way to Mongolia and to the foothills of Manchuria. Now, it varies in different parts. I divided it for convenience into three major zones. One would be the western steppes that usually Volga River or the Ural River is taken as the boundary. The other of the great central steppes, more or less equivalent to Kazakhstan today, which is an immense area. It's almost as large as Western Europe. And then the eastern steppes, which are better known to many of your listeners, which would be the Mongolian grasslands, bounded from the south by the Gobi Desert, and beyond that, the great rivers of China. On all of this land, it was sometime between, let's say, 4000 and 3000 BC, that people dwelling on the steppes learned that they could exploit the grasslands to sustain great herds of animals, sheep, goat, cattle. The domestication of the horse proved decisive because that became the beast of burden. It could be a source of winter meat if necessary, and it also became the prime animal used in war. And that developed first on the western steppes among Indo-European speakers. These would be people speaking a language. It's usually abbreviated PIE by linguists, meaning Proto-Indo-European. And we really don't know the language. It was never written down. It's been reconstructed from the Dora languages based on predictable rules of grammar, pronunciation, and euphony. And this is the mother tongue of many of the languages from Ireland to India. And the spreading of these languages was a result of the success of these nomadic peoples on the western steppes and harnessing grass as a way of sustaining themselves. Now, there always was scattered agriculture in some of the river valleys. We know that from reports by Herodotus talking about the Scythians. The Chinese make reference to some farming going on also on the steppes. But primarily, it was the products of their animals. It would be skins, furs, dairy products, meat, which was most valuable and which sustained them and also provided the goods to exchange with sedentary civilizations on the edge of those steppes. It's a vast region, and it's bound to the north by the taiga, the Siberian forest zones, beyond the tundra, the frozen area. To the south, you'll encounter various deserts. You think of the Kizilkum and the Karakum in the central steppes, or Gobi on the eastern steppes. And so the people of the steppes lived in this narrow band. It's a land subject to incredible extremes of temperature. And Papeland mentioned that the only rest he could get in the shade as he was traveling to the Mongol court in the 13th century was to sleep in the midday underneath his cart, his ox-drawn cart. And at first he cursed having opted for a cart over riding, and then came to appreciate that cart when he realized there's no shade in the high summer, and the temperature can get absolutely brutal. And then in the winter, you have the same extremes, and we have reports of how the nomads were able to survive in winter, both from recent reports of people who've lived among them, as well as the report of Ibn Fadlan, very well known for his account of the Vikings on the Volga, but he was really sent there to parley with nomadic who were Volga Bulgars who had recently converted to Islam, and on his way, he is hosted in the winter by these Oghuz Turks who are huddled together in their mobile home and tents, and he remarks about the hospitality, the months of really just surviving the brutal cold, and how hospitality and one's word and transactions is all important among these groups in order for them to survive. So it breeds a population that can endure great extremes. No weaklings survive in this environment. All adult males who are free are both hunters and warriors, and once they've domesticated the horse, starting from about 2000 BC on, they innovated first with the light chariot, and then later in the early Iron Age, let's say about 1,000 years later, the mounted warrior. And in both instances, whether they're using chariots or they're mounted on horses, they have this composite bow that makes them absolutely formidable foes. So the landscape, the great distances, the harsh climate, the constant need to look for forage, grasslands for their animals, water, and the need to trade with sedentary civilizations to obtain goods that they themselves cannot produce, keeps them on the move. And it makes them extremely adaptable. And one aspect I hope the book conveys is that these people are extremely able and clever and learn rapidly what is necessary to survive. And it's really wrong to simply think of them as barbarians who don't live in cities and don't write great books and don't eat bread, as the ancient people in the Near East would say, that they're just wild. That's a misrepresentation.
Well, okay, so it's worth pointing out if people want to look at where cavalry begins and then spreads outward from like a drop in water, you drop a pebble in water and you see the surrounding ripples. I mean, you can see the spread of cavalry, as you said, starting with cavalry that's hooked up to chariots and carts, and then eventually you get riders, and you can see it spread to places like Assyria. I mean, you can see China go from having foot nomadic peoples in the western areas, like the Rung and the Di and people like that, all of a sudden become mounted, and it's an entirely new ball game for them security-wise once that happens. So let's talk about this, because as a fan of military history, I'm always intrigued by the fact that once you combine the horse and the composite bow that you just mentioned, you have a weapon system, especially when you hook it to people who grow up with it, as opposed to taking some Byzantine peasant and training them as a mounted archer. It's very different when you take a Hunnic kid who's been on a horse since 3 years old, shooting at rats and mice as a little child. Once you combine that weapon system, you have something that isn't going to be made obsolete until almost the Napoleonic era. That's hard to get your mind around when weapon systems go obsolete as quickly as they do today. Talk to us a little bit about, I mean, even Comanche warriors are adopting the same system. What makes that such a difficult to deal with, such a formidable weapon system, the bow and the horse?
Well, first, the horse gives mobility, and most of these, as you should also note, most of these warriors have several mounts, and they can cover great distances rapidly. The Mongol army can ride 3 times faster than any of its opponents with components of infantry and cavalry. And that is, they can switch from horse to horse, they have fresh mounts always with them. These horses are also extremely sturdy. They can forage on the steppes, even forage under the snow. And so when the Mongols invade Europe in 1242, I mean, Baku catches the Europeans by surprise. They're still in winter quarters, more or less. It isn't quite yet spring, and yet the Mongols can move around rapidly. So strategically, they have great mobility, and this strikes terror in the hearts of their foes. They never are able to get an accurate count of how many there are. Usually, these forces are much smaller than literary sources report. Literary sources will talk of hundreds of thousands. You're probably dealing with an army of 30,000, maybe 50,000. It's an enormous army. And the full Mongol levy in the time of Genghis Khan at his death in 1227 was probably somewhere around 130 to 150,000, of whom many of them were Turks rather than actually Mongols. Tactically, this weapon is ideal for attacking mixed formations of infantry and cavalry that depend on a tactic of bringing the enemy to close combat, where you can use edge weapons to overcome them, whether it's the Roman gladius, whether it's a pike, whether it's a halberd in the Middle Ages. The shock action is what's supposed to decide the battle, but the nomads don't play fair. They will attack these formations, raining arrows into these forces, usually injuring the horses of their foe, maddening the infantry to get so angry that they'll break ranks and try to pursue. And what they do is refuse to close in close quarters and draw their foes out in a ill-advised counterattack. And as they scatter, they'll then turn upon them and ambush them. Or they have the great, it's called the Scythian shot in, sorry, a Scythian shot in Greek sources, in which the warrior can turn behind with his composite bow and still shoot at a pursuing foe. Battle after battle is lost as a result of the use of these tactics by the armies of sedentary civilizations. The most famous one is the Battle of Manzikert in 1071, where the Seljuk Turks managed to break the discipline of the Byzantine army, and it simply panics, and it then becomes a massacre where they attack and destroy the scattered panic forces. So to defeat such an army requires immense coordination between cavalry and infantry. We have a number of manuals that talk about that. The earliest one in the West is Arrian's Battle Tactics Against the Alans, which is a Sarmatian tribe that first invaded Carolina around 135 AD, and he has had direct experience in positioning his infantry, his cavalry supports, and maintaining discipline. The same tactics are advised by a Byzantine manual of the 6th century AD and almost a contemporary manual in China. Usually your best option, and the early Tang emperors in China understood this, is to hire nomadic warriors to do the fighting for you, and at least have some kind of control on some of the inner barbarians, as the Chinese would call them. Those would be the tribes dwelling along the Great Wall, in your immediate vicinity. They've become accustomed to Chinese ways to some extent, but they still retain the traditions of the steppes. And you hire them as your warriors, because what better option do you have? As you mentioned at the start of it, that to ride horses and to use a bow this effectively is a lifetime experience. And you just don't recruit peasants and arm them with bows and try to force them to ride horses and get the kind of results you want. That's just a fact. China's also hamstrung by the fact that they could never breed effective horses in China proper because of the soil. It doesn't have the minerals necessary for strong bows. And so even if they try to mount Chinese warriors, they're dependent on importing horses from the nomadic tribes. And that's a big point in all of these treaties, where silk is paid out to the most prominent nomadic confederacy, whether he's called a Khan or Chan Yu, whatever his title. And in return, the Chinese emperor expects thousands of horses for his army.
I'm fascinated with both the physics and the human morale side of battle, because when you talked about the Scythian shot or the Parthian shot, and the fact and the feigned flight, as it's called for the audience out there, the idea that you can pretend to be fleeing and some of the enemy may pursue you, and that breaks up their formation, making them vulnerable. I'm always amazed how many people should know better, whether it's the Byzantine manuals, the Chinese manuals, or even when one steppe tribe is fighting another, and they're very aware of the feigned flight tactic, and yet somehow they can be encouraged to pursue anyway. I mean, I remember reading about the Mangudai that the Mongols had, which were supposed to encourage something, and I remember a teacher telling me that they were even recruiting people that might even be good actors, right? To really be able to say, no, this isn't a trick, we really are fleeing, we really are scared of you. So there's a physics or a morale thing involved where even when you know better, you get suckered into some of these things sometimes. I'm also interested, and maybe you can explain this to me, I remember reading the early accounts of the Huns' appearance in Europe and the Mongols describing them as so ungodly, ugly, alien-like, and all these kinds of things. And I remember in the 1970s as a kid thinking that this is just a Roman encountering a person from a very different ethnicity that they're not used to. But now we know, and the skulls have been found, and you mentioned it in your book about things like the head binding, and all those sorts of things that would have created something that to a Roman may have looked, well, to somebody today, go look at the skulls, may have looked extremely unnatural. Can you talk a little about what these people may have looked like and why?
Well, you're drawing on the account of Ammianus Marcellinus, who was the first Roman to report about the Huns, and they would have arrived on the eastern edge of the western steppes about 370 AD, and they came crashing into the Goths, who were Germanic people living on the Russian steppes, the South Russian steppes, and the Romans had had contact with the Goths for over 2 centuries. In fact, they had treaties with the Goths. Many of them were recruited into patrolling this area for the benefit of Rome and received subsidies. Ammianus claims that they're not even humans. They look like stumps. They are comparatively short. They have the deformed head, scars. They ride around on their horses. They're noted for head taking, which is a common phenomenon on the steppes, either taking heads or scalps, same as reported in Scythians. And these people would have been of Eastern Asian origin. They would not be Europode, as you would say. And they spoke what was probably an agglutinative language. We're not exactly sure how to classify it because the words we have in the Hun language are mostly proper names. And they very quickly subjected a wide variety of people. So there's lots of Iranian and Aromatic names and objects that are associated with them. But they were seen as unusually foreign and unusually ferocious. They made war violently. They were able to defeat the Goths and drive many of them into the Roman Empire. And it's the Hun migration into Central Europe that ultimately drives many of the Germanic tribes into the Roman Empire. And then as a result of their depredations and attacks on the Eastern Empire and their great invasion of Western Europe in 451 and 452, they tipped the balance to the Germanic tribes who have settled in the Roman Empire as the future of Europe. And they play a very decisive role that way. But in terms of battle, you can go back and read John Keegan's book on Face of Battle, which really was a groundbreaking work in military history. I'm sure many of your listeners are familiar with that work. And one of the irresistible impulses is to see the enemy turn his back and flee. That is generally when the greatest number of casualties are suffered by the defeat of their pursuit. And the nomads do all these scattered attacks and then show their backs and flee. And it's very hard to keep soldiers in line when they see that. Even well-trained soldiers have the tendency to probably, now's our chance to get back at them. You know, they've been shooting these arrows at us all day. It hasn't been a good army day. I've been forced to stay in the same place in the hot sun. Now they're fleeing. Well, let's go get those guys. And that would especially be true of the supporting cavalry. That would probably go after them and gallop, and they're usually more heavily armored, not as nimble as the nomadic warriors. And they start to break up in formation, and this is just the ideal time to carry out an ambush. You'll have some of your fellow warriors waiting in a concealed position to take them in flank. The ones fleeing will suddenly turn around and start launching their arrows, and some of them will close for hand-to-hand combat as scattered battles, individual combat, in which these warriors excel. So maintaining that discipline is very difficult, and it comes through in manual after manual in dealing with these foes. And as late as, say, oh gosh, and you're right, Napoleonic Wars, I'm thinking of the wars between the armies of the Holy Roman Emperor, the Habsburg Emperor, and the Ottomans. The Ottomans deploying many, what we would call Tatars from South Russia as allies, and Prince Eugene of Savoy, keep strict formations. Don't break up when they pull this stunt. And that's the psychology of the heat of battle. Checking your impulses from throwing away a victory, or at least a strategic draw. And generally, that's usually the best an army of a secondary civilization can really achieve over these people would be a strategic draw. And the best way to deal with them, at least on the eastern steppes, would be the Chinese would wage winter campaigns and try to catch the campsites in their winter grounds and capture horses, destroy the mobile homes, the yurt, and take many prisoners. And if you drew an analogy to the plains, India, you think of Carolyn Martin, winter campaigns, and I was a sucker for the westerns growing up. I was born in 1951. So I'm a big fan of the Searchers. And there's that incident where John Wayne sees the U.S. cavalry.
That was just what I was thinking of. This is Custer and the Little Bighorn. Yeah.
Attack the Comanche camp in the winter. Following the strategy that Sheridan and Sherman had framed. It's not too different.
Well, now, let's talk a little bit about ethnicity, because to me that's one of the more surprising things about the entire steppe, and also the makeup of some of these tribes. I remember you mentioned the Terror mummies, but I remember reading very early accounts of the Turks, and we think of the Turks as looking like the people in Turkey today, although that's a wide variety of people, obviously, too.
Yeah.
But the early accounts would have green-eyed Turks with red hair. I mean, stuff that just doesn't jive with our stereotypical views of today. You talked about the Yuezhian tribes on the western area of China looking and speaking much more Indo-European languages. Genghis Khan, maybe red hair and gray eyes. Talk to me a little about the fact that, you really, and the fact that these tribes would accept defeated enemies into their mix, and it's an ethnic estuary, isn't it?
Yeah, there's, the big test ultimately becomes language. How do you express yourself? Language is an interpretation of the world, and every language represents a slightly different interpretation, and that's why I always urge my students to learn more languages. Your sense of humor changes, the way you name objects, and my wife is Turkish, and believe me, a bilingual marriage is one that is constantly changing and constantly learning. And so you speak of the Turks today in the Republic of Turkey, or Turkey as they want to be called now, which is the Turkish name for the land. And you're looking at a minority of nomadic peoples who had embraced Islam, who arrived in the 11th and 12th centuries, and assimilated a vast majority. Perhaps only 6% of the DNA of the modern Turkish population actually can trace itself back to the steppes. The rest is that of the people who were originally there, as well as Balkan, Russian, Middle Eastern, all sorts of people who had moved into that area under the Ottoman Empire. And the same is true on the steppes, and that is the nomads would learn languages as necessary. The rapid expansion of the Turkish speakers in the early Middle Ages, which really to me marks the beginning of the Middle Ages on the steppes. The expansion by Blumen and the Turks, starting in 550 across the central and eastern steppes, when they overthrew their overlords. Many of the people on the steppes there would have been speaking Iranian, Tocharian, different types of Indo-European languages, but they had had long contact with Turkish tribes because there aren't any neat boundary lines that you have in a modern state. They move to make use of the land. And a tribe will be in a certain area, another tribe shows up, which speaks a different language, and either they fight each other or they end up coming to some sort of agreement in which one tribe has grazing rights and lets it to use the same water source. There's celebrations, and invariably marital ties are cemented. So these people are constantly interacting with each other and changing. And what happens is many of the people who spoke Iranian languages end up speaking Turkish. That's why when you go out to Western China, in what the locals want to call the Uyghur where the Uyghurs are today, you'll find many Uyghurs with fair hair and green eyes, and they're probably descended ultimately from Tocharian ancestors. Others will show traits that they came from the Middle East. Others will show traits that they came from East Asia, but they all speak Uyghur Turkish, itself a mixture of several other languages. But that's what identifies. And then, as these tribes embrace one of the monotheistic creeds, such as Islam, where they embrace Buddhism, that becomes another way of defining who they are, their religious views, and how they reconcile that religion with their traditional nomadic beliefs and spirits and shamans. So that's going on constantly. And the notion of all the Huns looking like what Ammianus said, or some of these depictions of the Huns from the 19th century where they're magnified as the yellow peril from the east, destroying Roman civilization. These are overdrawn. The Hun armies of Attila comprised many Iranian speakers, Germanic speakers, and Attila himself is remembered as a great king in Norse and Germanic legend. He lives on as one of the great lords who had a court of great warriors. And in the German tradition, if you ever read the German epic, the Lovley, he's depicted quite favorably, actually. So you are correct. There's constant movement and mixture going on. And likewise with the sedentary civilizations. Any great lord like Modu Chanyu, who in the 2nd century BC established the Confederacy of Shuangnu, will negotiate with the Han Emperor in order to get Chinese brides for himself and for his immediate supporters, because that elevates him in the status of his subjects. And that's just a given. They're prone to outmarry like that.
One of the things I found very valuable in the book was you being able to put to rest a bunch of the questions that we've often had studying the steppe people forever. For example, you just mentioned both Attila and the Shuangnu, and the idea of whether or not the Huns and the Shuangnu were the same people. In your book, you took the firm belief that new information has shown that they were not. Am I correct in saying that?
Yeah, I think at most they're familiar with the term. Puno is apparently how the Chinese pronounce Shuangnu, and Chinese, scholars, sinologists, I guess you would call them, historians of China. It was a fearful term that was adopted by these people. At most, they were a vassal tribe or a distant subject of the Shuangnu, but there's no direct connection. And the review of the archaeological evidence in the period of Attila, that is the Hun hegemony in Europe, of jewelry, pottery styles, and all, really shows no connections to the earlier material you find in East Asia. Now, there are arguments that have been made that the Huns were heirs to some kind of steppe imperial administration. That's made by one scholar in particular, but I just don't see it. What I do see is that the Huns in Europe are familiar with exchanges with sedentary civilizations, and they're just quick studies. The Shuangnu learned that writing was very valuable. Well, so did the Huns as soon as they came into contact with the Roman Empire. Attila had both Greek and Roman secretaries who could draft letters, treaties, any kind of document he would want. And we don't know what languages Attila spoke besides the Hun language. He may well have known a fair amount of Latin and some kind of East Germanic dialect to talk to some of his leading vassals. One of his secretaries, Orestes, ends up going back into imperial service after Attila dies and puts his son on the throne as the last Western emperor, Romulus Augustus. When the Hun Empire fragmented, Orestes, with a whole bunch of probably unemployed warriors of Attila, offers himself to the Western court and eventually ends up putting his son on the throne. And it goes to show how easily people from sedentary civilizations can move into the nomadic world and then move back. There's a constant movement that way. Genghis Khan won the support of many people who were known as Khitans in North China, who had ruled there and hated the then ruling North Chinese dynasty, and they went over to the Mongols. Kublai Khan literally built a Chinese army and navy to conquer the Sun. And you find this constant cooperation that the nomads are able to engage different peoples who have skills from the sedentary civilizations. Attila has it. You're interested in military history. Attila can take cities with engineers. These are clearly Romans in the service of Attila. Genghis Khan had his Chinese engineering corps, which Kublai Khan expanded by adding Iranians and Arabs, compliments of his brother, Hulagu, who sent some of the best men to. So there is a constant need for them to innovate, and especially in the art of war, they're extremely receptive to innovations.
Let me change gears here. So there's a wonderful line that I've always liked, that history is just one damn thing after another. And if you look at the entire scope of your book and the subject matter, from early times to the Renaissance, if you wanted to almost classify that as one eruption of steppe people after another, and I'm kind of interested in the idea that there always seems to be another more ferocious, more dangerous, more tough, more energetic, more resourceful tribe, always waiting in the wings. You know, the Magyars get to deal with the Pechenegs. I mean, there's always somebody other. So can you explain the rationale is not the right word, but what's going on there, that there's always got to be another tribe looking to supplant the one that's just settled down, and to use the old Chinese word for it, and just been cooked, you know, in terms of a civilization sense?
Well, what happens is those that move off the steppes into the settled zones, in many instances they become assimilated, and they'll embrace the dominant culture, although sometimes they will retain the language as the Turks, and as the Hungarians did. You know, Hungarians retain a language that's not related to the other European languages. It's a Ugrian language that is remotely related to Turkish and Mongolian. And new people fill in behind. And you have to realize that it doesn't take much for these groups to become overcrowded and for the resources to become scarce. Just a couple of bad summers, and you are desperate to move on. And many of these migrations take the form of individual groups, small groups of 20, 50, moving on their own, looking for water, looking for grass, and then sending news back to their relatives. Oh, come west, or go east, or go southeast. You'll find better pastures. And what happens is they'll run into the occupants of the area, and some kind of fighting is going to ensue. And that means they're constantly struggling around themselves to make sure they have sufficient water and grass for their animals, to have access to trade with sedentary civilizations, and the competition is fierce. And if you don't win a battle, the consequences are pretty severe in many instances. They'll massacre the adult males. They might keep some of the specialists, good craftsmen, and some of the women, but the defeated really get killed because the resources are so limited. And so there's a constant movement, because no sedentary civilization can control this area. The only individual who ever managed to rule large sections of the steppe was the Tang Emperor Taizong in the 7th century. He was able to overthrow the Turkish Khanate and control the eastern and western Turks in his lifetime, but his successors immediately lost control. And one of the reasons was that he was accepted by many of the Turks as a great warrior in his own right, and in many ways preferred the martial life of the steppes to his Mandarin Confucian bureaucrats. But he's an exception. And as you mentioned, it's only when you have effective firearms, not just artillery, but handheld firearms, that the Russians on one end and the Chinese on the other move in to essentially divide control of the steppes and stop this movement and prevent this cycle of tribes moving around and jostling. And all of a sudden, one group realizes, for us to be more effective, we have to build up a more successful confederation. And so first you get the Shuang Nu, then you get the Ruan Khans, and then you get the Turks, and then you get the Uyghurs. Each time a confederacy learning from its predecessors, and the necessity to be able to feed its population and have access to the goods of the sedentary civilization. So they do. They learn. They get better. And the best of all are the Mongols. And even by the standards of the 13th century, the Mongols waged war fiercely on a massive scale of massacre in order to break the will of their opponents. And Chinese, Muslim, Western Christian, Russian sources all report atrocities which shocks them, and these are people who do not wage war among themselves according to the Geneva Convention. I mean, they're pretty brutal themselves. But the Mongols have taken this warfare on the steppes and refined it to a very high degree of destruction. And some would argue that Genghis Khan and his son and grandsons were waging war almost on a genocidal level in some instances.
Well, let's talk about that a minute, because that was always the prevailing portrayal of the Mongols, right? The Russians have never ceased explaining how horrible it was. But there were some books that came out a little while back that made Genghis Khan sound like, well, you know the old line about the trade-offs of empire, right? On one hand, on one hand you have the trade-offs on empire. On the other hand, you have the Romans create a wasteland and call it peace. So you fall plainly on the side that the accounts of the Mongols creating towers of skulls and rivers of fats and all those things are real, and that this, I remember having a conversation with somebody where they were talking about how the Mongols were so religiously tolerant, and I said, but they can do anything they want to you, right? I mean, so it's like saying they can take your daughter for a slave, but they're religiously tolerant. So explain to me a little, if you can. So I guess what I'm saying is you're buying the historical portrayal of the Mongols and steppe people's, well, let's talk about ancient warfare the same way, but this is brutality on, like you said, practically a genocidal scale.
Yeah, and that is because of several factors. In the Mongols, once you go to war, all bets are off. If a city resists and then surrenders or falls, the conqueror has complete control of it and can do what he wishes. And you'll have to negotiate surrender almost immediately before you can resist. And one of the reasons for the terror is to drive people in the countryside into the city, spreading rumors of the massive Mongol army approaching and the dangers you're in the hope that the city will just surrender. Another aspect is that it's warfare is personal. When close members of Mongols, of Genghis Khan's family are killed in battle, he takes that personally. It's a code of honor, and the entire city or area will be devastated to propitiate the spirit of that lost relative. That's an awful price to pay, but you have to remember they are still operating in very much a heroic martial ethos in which one's honor is at stake, and killing your close family members is an insult to your honor, and they will pay the price. Rebellion, and any kind of rebellion, is treated incredibly harshly, and you see that in the cities of Iran and Transoxiana. Transoxiana would be today essentially Uzbekistan, and the Mongols would just brutally punish cities that have rebelled, especially if they've killed members of the Mongol garrison or envoys, whatever the case will be. So there no doubt is exaggeration. There's all these apocalyptic terms that are used. You've got Matthew Paris in England coining the name Tartars for the Mongols, meaning they come from Tartarus, the classical underworld that is hell, and they're the devil's horsemen. But the